Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. This week we're going to do a watercolour painting of an outdoor scene but from working indoors. So in other words, the view out of a window. And you can see I've got my water spray bottle and water pot ready to go. Now I've started out with a Sharpie marker pen sketch. Lilac for the background, a brown for the midground, and then for the foreground a bright red. And I've used that to draw the curtain and the window, which I'm using to frame the composition. So the idea is to hopefully begin to convey a sense of depth even at this early stage with just the line drawing. So I've taped the paper to my drawing board and I'm working from an easel today. So this is A2 mixed media paper and I'm using Winsor & Newton watercolour paints and a synthetic round mop brush, which is really lovely because it comes to a beautiful point but carries loads of water, so I can be really expressive but fairly precise at the same time. Started out with a kind of purply grey wash for the distant hills. That looks like it could be sky, but it's actually distant hills. And as you can see, I'm really quite happy to mop up a little bit of that wash with a paper towel if it goes a little bit astray. The next step is to come in with a fairly neutral green. Now what I mean by that is obviously you can mix up a green with blue and yellow, but I want it to go a little bit towards the brown, so there's a little bit more red in there than there perhaps would be normally. And you know, I want this to be a dull, subdued green because I want the distant trees and the bushes and stuff to be, you know, off into the distance. Although it's not that far away, you know, it's less than 100 yards, but I still want to create some sense of depth in this painting. And my hope is that, you know, the lilac outlines of this distant part of the drawing and painting, if some of those show through, that's going to help convey that sense of depth. And also you could use it as kind of a reminder to yourself to keep it very clear in your mind how you're going to paint different sections of the painting. So for example, I've just used kind of a purply grey again to put in some colour on the rooftops there of those distant houses, and that's probably all I'll do for those distant houses. Same type of thing for the distant fence there in the background that I'm putting in now, and even I can continue some of that colour onto the tree trunks. So the way I tend to work is I'm definitely looking at my reference, or in this case the real life view that I'm painting, and I'm definitely trying to mimic those colours to an extent. But then if I've got that colour on the brush, even if it's not in keeping with exactly what I'm seeing, but I think it will kind of work in the, you know, it'll be in the right ballpark and it'll kind of work on a whole for that area of the painting, then I'll fire that in on a tree trunk, even though I might have mixed it up for a house earlier. Now part of what stimulated me to paint this scene was the lovely dappled shadow from the trees onto the car park area beyond the fence, and also the little burst of light shining through the little cat door in the garden gate. So you can see I've started to indicate some of those shadows with the grey, and I'm doing the same on the fence, and really all I'm doing here initially is establishing a sense of light and dark. And with watercolour what I can do is I can just put down these gentle washes everywhere initially, and then I can darken the ones in the midground, further darken and embolden in terms of colour the stuff in the foreground, and leave the background more or less untouched, and that will hopefully create the sense of depth that I was talking about. So you can see the shadow cast by the garden gate. There's a nice little square of light there on the ground from the little cat door. Now I've switched to a slightly darker and more blue wash for the right-hand curtain, and this is, you know, going against convention a little bit. Generally we think of blue pushing things off into the distance. It's a cooler temperature, And generally things are more blue the further away they are. You know, distant hills can look very blue. But it's nice to experiment a little bit. So if you go dark enough, even with a blue, it can still bring things forward. But at this early stage, it's a really lovely time to experiment with a watercolour painting because, you know, you're probably going to go over some of these washes a little bit. Certainly in the foreground. So I continued that wash along part of the windowsill. The light is catching the windowsill in the section which is closest to me. So I've left that unpainted for the moment. Just did a little bit of the same wash for the shadow areas in the nearby bushes within the garden. And now I'm adding some to the window frame. I'm coming in now with a fairly, relatively warm brown for this distant grass. And it certainly looks really quite warm in comparison to what I've put down. But my hope is that because I'm putting this down as a very weak wash, then, you know, again, it's kind of like what I was saying for the foreground a moment ago, but in reverse. I'm hoping that even with that warmth, it'll be a weak enough wash that I can, you know, keep the distance looking distant. Now, working near vertical like this with watercolour, you have to be somewhat aware of how the paint is going to trickle down the paper and be alert to any runs that might occur or any beads of watercolour which might occur. So, for example, below the trees you can see there's quite a heavy near horizontal bead of watercolour which I could exploit or I might need to mop up. And while I've been chatting, I kind of dapped the brush on the paper to start to indicate some foliage. And the little beads there, they may help me create some texture. So, but at the same time, I'm always ready with my paper towel if I need to mop that up. So working flat can be advantageous in that you tend not to get the beads, but equally you might get some pooling of the watercolour. So, you know, any of these things can be an advantage or a disadvantage. It just depends how we choose to react to them. Now I'm coming in with a colour which is, you know, reasonably close to the colour of the fence. This is alizarin crimson mixed in with, you know, mostly cadmium yellow. Probably just a touch of blue as well. And again, it's a little bit of a stronger wash than before. So I'm starting to introduce some real warmth to the foreground and going over with a second wash, which is going to strengthen the tone as well. Now I need to be a little bit careful around the outlines of the bushes there because I want to maintain something of a jagged, loose outline. And a little more red in the mix for the fence in the neighbouring garden. There's not much of that showing. And one of the things I'm being mindful of here is there are going to be areas in this painting, perhaps over to the right, to the left-hand side, and over to the top right-hand corner, where I'm not going to, you know, work them up to very much detail at all, so that our view is going to be focused out the window to the gate with that little burst of light on the shadow that I've mentioned a couple of times now, and then off beyond through the trees to the house that I'm painting right now. Now the foliage and bushes and flowers in the garden are obviously a huge mix of colours, and I'm being mindful of the lightest colour we've got here. So it's generally easier in watercolour to work from light to dark. So this is pretty much pure cadmium yellow, and you can see I've just popped you know, a nice blotch of that down on the right hand side there, and a couple of little dots on the left of the path to the gate to represent some flowers. So I would have cleaned my water and my brush, even though I'm basically using one brush, before I'd mixed up that yellow. I've added a little bit of blue now, a little bit of ultramarine blue, a little bit of red, and a very loose textural wash going on for the next bit of the foliage. continuing with that technique, but with a slightly darker green over on the left. And just picking up that little bead of watercolor and making some marks within the wash, so that hopefully we'll get some, you know, nice drying marks essentially. Now I want to darken some of the shadows that are being cast on the tree trunks. So I'm coming in with a darker green now. So this is, you know, mostly ultramarine blue, a little bit of the cadmium yellow, and just a touch of the red. But again, I've got to be a little bit careful to not make things too dark. But that said, by darkening these areas, what that's going to help me do is push that house in the centre of the top of the picture off into the distance. So as I work from distant to foreground, I want things to become gradually darker and darker, and gradually warmer and brighter as well. So the distance from the window to the house, if it's 100 yards, I'd be surprised if it's quite that far. So, but nevertheless, I still needed to kind of create a sense of depth, so slightly exaggerate perhaps the feeling of depth, because that generally makes for a more interesting painting, I think. So there are cast shadows on the area of grass as well from the tree. So I think it can be quite interesting actually to have a cast shadow. So I think it can be quite interesting to have a cast shadow in a painting where the object that is casting the shadow is actually out of frame. I think that makes for a nice little curiosity. But back to the bush in the garden, coming in with a deeper green again, and you can see I'm applying that in a dappled version, changing the angle that I put the brush down. And that's one of the great things with this brush actually. You know, the angle you put the brush down on the paper, it really changes the shape of the mark that you can create, and so it's a really lovely way to work. Similar technique on the bushes in the neighbouring garden, but I'm not being overly concerned with those. I'm really just filling in the negative spaces created with the open window and the rest of the window frame. But you know, including a little bit of variation where I can. And then adding a little bit to the plants on the left-hand side of the path. And one of the things to try and avoid when you're doing this type of work is try to avoid repeating the same motif, if you like. So if you put the brush down in a certain way and it creates a nice kind of leaf shape or edge of a bush shape, that's great, but you probably don't want to repeat that too often. Now a brighter and warmer green, so more yellow in the mix now, to give us a little bit of variation as we move to the plant in the centre of the garden. And you can see I'm taking somewhat of an impressionist approach to this. You know, I'm certainly not trying to draw every leaf. And then putting some of that second green in amongst the first. So, you know, plants in real life, obviously they kind of merge and overlap. So there's no harm in that. Here I'm just rolling the brush to experiment with the different types of mark I can get. And I would say that when you're using watercolor, especially, perhaps more so than any other medium, doing a particular technique like rolling the brush with a very wet brush compared to, you know, an almost dry brush, it's going to give you a very different effect. And that's true for all, you know, acrylic or whatever. But I think I'm probably right in saying that the differences are perhaps more extreme in watercolor. So definitely worth experimenting with that. Now, the initial indication of the shadows cast by the trees onto the parking area didn't go down dark enough. So I'm using a nice purple here, so much more purple and brighter than the shadows are in real life, although there is some blue in the shadows in real life. But I'm just kind of putting down a darker dappled shadow pattern. Being careful to leave some of the unpainted white of the paper showing through. And I'm overlaying that same colour on some of the now dry shadow areas of the distant grass and the tree trunks as well. Same shadow colour for the windows, applied fairly lightly, and a little bit of shadow under the eave of the roof. And even the wheel of the car and a little bit of the cast shadow, or to darken the windows of the car, we can begin to do that because those darker areas, the very dark areas within a painting, we can build up with several layers of washes, and that will create a more interesting dark than if you just go in with black, for example. A nice deep purple now for the shadow cast by the gate to really make that little window of light in the shadow pop. But you can see that I've accidentally started to paint over the window frame, so I had to act a bit quickly and lift off some of that paint. Now, the shadow and the tone on the fence and the gate need to be much darker. So I've mixed up a nice reddish brown here. So alizarin crimson, touch of the cadmium yellow, that would give me a reddish orange, and then just gradually add a little bit of blue until you get the kind of brown that you want. You see here I'm adding some vertical brush strokes, and you can see I've kind of just approximated the pattern of the wood on the fence there very quickly. It's not something I'm overly concerned about, but you know, it's nice to include if you can a little bit of texture. Same idea with the fence coming towards the house. So you can see that there's a sense of depth starting to be created now that we've darkened the stuff in the garden and kept the distant house with that initial wash only, pretty much. You know, you can almost feel you could walk out the gate and across the parking area, across the grass, hop the fence and go to that house. Now I've switched to a smaller round brush now, and almost straight out of the tube cadmium yellow to just add a few highlights of you know, where the petals on flowers are. Sorry, I said almost pure cadmium yellow. It's not actually. I've mixed in a little bit of the alizarin crimson there to give me an orange. Now, in the same way that I darkened the fence, I need to darken a little bit areas of the window frame, because the light is obviously coming in from outside, and so to make that look as if light is coming from the outside, the inside needs to be darker, basically. Now you can see I've switched to a synthetic flat brush here, and this can be really useful because if you want to get a reasonably straight edge to your brushstroke, then it's a lot easier to do that than with the big round mop that I was using. But in addition, you get these lovely parallel brushstrokes as well. So what I mean by that is lots of little parallel lines from individual bristles within the main brushstroke, and that can work well if you're painting something which is man-made. Now the curtain on the right needs to be really quite dark, and you can see I'm adding a purple wash, quite a deep purple wash, to that area. And I've switched back to my round mop brush now. And while that's still wet, I add some a darker amount of paint again to regions where there are deep shadows because of the folds in the fabric. So I'm doing a little bit of wet in wet there to see what happens, really. And while I'm working with that level of tone, I change the colour a little bit and start to introduce some of the deeper shadows with the point of the big brush on the fence. Now, big brushes are something I love to work with, because it kind of encourages you not to get too tight and too fussy. But, it can cause problems as well sometimes, so I kind of went in with my finger there just to soften things up a bit. Again, I'm taking this approach where I'm looking at the painting as a whole and just adding areas of shadow. Now, in particular, you can see there's a car which looks white at the moment, and then to the left of that there's actually another car or van. I'm barely going to paint that car or van, it's just going to be suggested. So back to the smaller brush now. I'm starting to introduce some darker tone to that parked car. And I'm putting in some darker bluey shadows around the car here to make it just stand out from the background a little bit, and also because this region of foliage does need darkening somewhat. But I need to be careful. So this is, we talked about the big brush earlier. This is one of the dangers of the small brush. You can get into enjoying all the fiddly little details a bit too much, or I can at least. And if you do that, then that's a dangerous moment, because you can tend to start to bring forward your background. So it's okay to suggest some detail here and there, but you don't want to go, too crazy with it. But at the same time, you see the smaller brush is really useful for some of these cast shadows I'm putting down now in this region of grass. So it would be, I probably could do it with the big brush, but it's a little more fiddly. Now I'm just adding a few touches of a warmer green, just to try and create the impression of sunlight on that distant little woodland there. Again, I've got to be a bit careful so that it doesn't compete with the foreground, but I felt that area was looking a little too washed out considering how close it is to the window. So the house beyond, I'm definitely going to keep pale. And you can see also that adding in that area of warmth has also affected how the shadows on the parking area look as well. Now what I'm doing here is just tidying up the edge of that foliage section, because it's quite tricky really, because you've got an area of the bush which meets up with the line of the windowsill, and the line of the windowsill obviously needs to look pretty darn straight. It doesn't have to be perfect, you can get away with a little bit of variation, but it can't be too jagged. Now one of the things I haven't mentioned is the pattern on the curtain that I put in right in the initial drawing stage. And you can see how the way I've drawn the pattern, it really does convey a feeling of 3 dimensions, the folds in the fabric, and it's a really powerful way of doing that. And you know, you could almost do an entire drawing or painting of almost any subject by just describing the pattern on the surfaces or putting some artificial patterning in to create a feeling of 3 dimensions. So definitely, you know, worth keeping that technique in mind. Now I want to darken the area of tone next to those flowers a little bit, just to make them seem a little bit brighter. And in doing this, I'm sort of losing some of the purity of the wash on the fence, to be honest with you, but I kind of felt it was just about worth doing, just to make the flowers pop a little bit more. So I'm kind of deviating from what's happening in reality here and doing what I feel works best for the painting. Now I'm adding a coat of that brown to the shadow so that it's closer to the colour it is in reality, but also to differentiate the shadow cast by the gate from the shadows cast by the tree on the parking area beyond the fence. And I just put in a couple of little lines, and I'm just highlighting that area now to make sure the gate has a thickness so that when you look through that little cat door, it's not just a square, it actually looks a little bit like it's a structure. So just adding a few lines and areas of darker tone to the 2 vehicles, just to bring them to life a little bit more than they were. I just wanted a warmer colour for the window frame, so I'm coming in with a light orange really. And you can see I've gone back to my big brush here, so although I was using the small brush, just a couple of minutes ago, I will go back to the big brush as often as I can. And having applied that weak orange wash, I thought, well, maybe that will work for the curtain as well. So you can see I've mixed up a much deeper, stronger version of that orange. And I'm being careful to keep the left-hand edge of the curtain a little bit unpainted so that it looks like it's catching the light. But I decided I didn't like that and I preferred the cooler colours I had there before, so I've sprayed a clean paper towel with plenty of water and just been as careful as I could be to lift off that orange without disturbing the underlying colour. And though, despite my care, I did remove some of it, so I'm having to darken that again now with a cooler purply grey, which I feel works better. It makes it seem it makes the outdoors seem brighter in the painting. And here I'm repeating the wet in wet technique I used for the shadows within the folds of the fabric. So I'm having to, unfortunately, redo some of the work I did earlier, but that's life. Back to these distant trees, and I still felt at this stage that there wasn't a strong enough sense of light coming through the trees, and in order to achieve that with the method of watercolor painting I'm using here, I need to darken the shadows a bit more than they were. So again, got to be careful, but I think I'm just about getting away with it here. Back to the small brush now to just soften some of the edges of those shadows and darken some of the tree trunks. And here I decided to warm up this section of the grass, which is close, even though it's in shadow, just needed to be a little warmer and more vibrant. But even at this late stage, you can see I'm trying to stay away from being too fussy. So just trying to be quick and expressive. Now, a couple of finishing touches. Some pure cadmium yellow applied fairly thickly, more or less straight out the tube with the narrow brush. And I'm just going to completely enhance the highlights along the top of the fence and the gate here. So here's a look at the finished painting. As with all my videos, if you click the link in the description below the video, then that will take you to a high resolution image and you can actually zoom in on different areas of the painting if you want to get a closer look at the brushwork. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.